See you later, Benny. Here for me is in London. I know that for here for you, most of you is maybe South Korea. I know for Joe it's Australia. There may be others around. So delighted that you can all join. We're going to talk about how organizations can make and save money with decentralized trust models. And I'm going to go through a kind of a bit of a process that we went through in terms of learning to come to a realization about how to think about the economic models that are available to us when we think about decentralized trust. So it's going to be a bit of a kind of a journey, a bit of kind of education. And hopefully I'm going to learn something as well. I'll be very delighted to hear questions at the end and discuss things. We aim to have, say, about 40 minutes of me talking and 20 minutes of discussion, or maybe 35 minutes of talking and 20 minutes of discussion. So basically, we're going to look at a few kind of real world examples. We're going to look at a few other sort of what I've called false profits and fake profits, with English spelling being a play on words here, about how we've previously thought about opportunities and how I think the new way of looking at opportunities is actually kind of far more attractive and potentially far more rewarding for all participants. So the first thing is, if we look on the internet for valuations of kind of digital identity or self-sovereign identity sort of models, we tend to find estimates like the ones I've shown to you on the screen here. So these are from 4 different recent sources. They're, you might think, reasonably optimistic or reasonably kind of impressive, perhaps. And we could perhaps see an aggregate value or an average value of something around 50 billion US dollars for the market value in the next 5 years. So by 2027. That's one way of looking at the market. Now, another way of looking at it was done by the RMIT Blockchain Hub, the economics professors of RMIT University in Australia a few years ago. They were looking at a particular kind of way of thinking about the whole of an economy. And they wondered how many people are employed in sort of roles inside organizations to actually ensure trust. So to check things, to make sure that the right participants are involved in something, or that the right endpoint is being used for payment or delivery and so on. So checking stuff. And their analysis of the sort of US labor market indicated around about 1/3 of all of the jobs in the US were jobs that were there to ensure kind of trust, to check things. So what their reasoning is in the paper, and there's a link to it, and I think you've got the PDF, is that 1/3 of jobs is in a sense accessible or potentially replaceable by improved trust systems. Now that can either be an economic disaster, suddenly 1/3 of people are unemployed, or it can be an economic sort of miracle because now they can do something far more useful than just checking stuff. And we can get an increased GDP and so on. So that I prefer to think of the latter, that we are able then to have people do far more interesting things that aren't just involved in checking stuff. So 1/3 of jobs potentially is another way of looking at the market. But I think both of these perspectives kind of underestimate the overall potential here. And there's a reason for that. The first one, if you like, they're looking at the value of the market, digital identity market. They almost invariably look at the share value and the revenues and so on of the tool providers of the platform. Jacques, can you go on mute? Maybe I'll mute you. Thank you, Jack. And so they look at the value of a market on the basis of how much can be sold or how much revenue can be gained or what the share value is of the tool makers, which is like saying that the value of the economic value of the shipping market is the cost of ships and the cost of crews, whereas in fact the shipping market enables an economy of significantly greater value. So every ship carries many general purpose containers. Each container contains a whole bunch of goods. It's trillions of dollars, not billions of dollars, that are transferred by those systems. So if we have an improved trust model, my argument is, in fact, the whole of the economy can be improved, not just tool vendors and direct employees. So the whole thing changes. It's a very different way of looking at the value of the market. Now, decentralized trust models offer kind of different way of thinking about the whole kind of market. They typically speaking disintermediate. They take out a middle player in a market. Now, middle players exist to kind of ease information transfer or understanding between 2 other participants that otherwise know each other and so on. But in a decentralized model, you don't have, as best you can, you don't have a centralized hub. So we now look at bilateral relationships, the relationships between the issuers and holders of things, between the holders and verifiers of things, and potentially between their relationship and the thing that I'm going to call the governance framework for all these 3. I need to do a bit of explaining about this. So the standard triangular model that you may well have seen if you've seen anything from Trust Over IP or from other organizations talking about this sort of way of thinking is to have a concept of an issuer, a holder, and a verifier. Those are the three that we typically draw. And the sort of roles they have, the issuer decides if and when and to whom they might issue a credential. They want to make sure the right people get the right credentials for the right reasons. That's kind of their role or their gift. And if the credentials are being used in the market, that they're both valid and current for use. So things like driving licenses and stuff would be a good example of that. The holder is the person or the institution that sort of earns and receives the credential from the issuer. So they've got to prove that they have in a sense the right to own the credential, that they meet the criteria, and they potentially sustain the requirements to meet that criteria, so that they can then use this credential to prove things about themselves or things about their organization. So they are a quality controlled organization, or that they are an individual with a license to do a certain thing. The verifier is the organization that's looking to check things about the holder so they can decide whether to release a service or a product. So the holder is saying, I want to do something, and the verifier is checking to see whether the holder meets the requirements of the service provision. So hiring a car, do you have a valid driving license, that kind of thing. Now, we can look at these simple triangular model can actually allow us to talk about things like federated, centralized, and decentralized systems. So the three are shown on this slide now. So a centralized system you can consider being where the issuer and the verifier are the same organization. So they've issued something they've issued you a login credential, say, and they're checking your login credential when you come back. Pretty simple. Federated is a model where the issuer and the verifier are in some sense in a trust sort of framework. So they have some way of trusting each other. Typically, the issuer holds information about you that authenticates you. The verifier holds things about you that are relevant to the application that you're using with the verifier. The verifier relies on the services of the issuer for authentication and login. So log in with Facebook, a government ID, or Google, or whatever else. That kind of thing is a federated system. In Australia, would have the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, TDIF, which is a federated identity system for mostly at the moment government services. Decentralized, there is no need for the verifier and the issuer to have any kind of direct communication in the process of verifying stuff. That's the aim. So that the credentials provide the verifiable data kind of on their own without the need to check anything with the issuer. Now, they only work because the verifier trusts the issuer. So they trust things, but they verify, to use an old rather hackneyed phrase from politics. But they can check things like who issued the data, has it been tampered with, was it issued to the person presenting it to me, was it issued to the holder? And they can even do things with a bit of extra work, like has it been revoked since it was issued? Does the data refer to somebody else, not the holder? So we might think of an example, like a birth certificate might be an example where a parent might present a birth certificate for their child. So the birth certificate might be relevant to the parent, that they are the parent named in the birth certificate, and the child might be a named subject of that birth certificate. So there are kind of a holder and there's a subject party. But why would a verifier trust the issuing organization? What would make them want to trust them? Well, that's when we start seeing a governance framework come into play. And we can see interplays, if you like, between the parties and the governance framework. So it enables trust between the verifier and the issuer, and between the holder and the other two parties. So basically, because there is a governance framework, and because people believe, if you like, that the governance framework is both active and provides the right safety checks and so on, everyone can trust each other. Now we can actually start using these simple sort of diagrams to produce quite complicated looking things. So this is a supply chain drawn with the same building blocks. And I'd argue actually is a reasonable representation of a supply chain in terms of there could be multiple governance frameworks across multiple sort of spans of control over different parties involved. So think of things like, I don't know, red meat supply chains if you're a red meat eater, or I don't know, Manuka honey if you're into honey. So different kinds of supply chains have different kind of governance across different parties at different stages. And we can actually start drawing that way that might work with the same sort of building blocks. Basically, we're now on the point where we can start thinking about what does this sort of mean for value exchanges in decentralized verification models. So if you look at the diagram and the way we particularly draw it in SUSU, with the governance framework in the middle, we end up with these sort of 6 bilateral sort of arcs between nodes. And so we consider each of these in turn. Now, the first few that I've highlighted in yellow here at the moment are kind of traditional. So they're traditional in the sense that if you think about the way an issuer and a holder might have an economic relationship, it's that the holder might pay to gain or retain credentials from the issuer. So in Australia, we pay for driving licenses. I'm pretty sure that's probably common around the world. You might pay fees to a university to participate as a student, and then to gain eventually a degree or diploma at the end of your courses. When we look at number two, between the holder and the verifier, typically there's a value exchange in the process of the holder asking to do something. So buying a concert ticket, proving you're over 18 years old, you're going to pay some money if you've proven that you meet the criteria that the verifier has for issuing you the ticket. So there's going to be a value exchange that we're fairly familiar with on number two. And number three is perhaps a little less familiar, but relatively obvious, that if the issuer is part of some sort of governance framework, typically there's a requirement for them to meet some sort of requirements and audits and so on. So ISO 9000 quality audits or other frameworks which require kind of re-accreditation, tax equality systems, and Australia for universities and so on. So there's typically a kind of a commercial exchange between the governance framework and the issuer, which we call number three. So these are all fairly familiar to us. Number four is where the verifier might pay a fee to be checked and registered on trusted lists. This is where, if the holder wants to be sure that they're only dealing with trusted verifiers, they need to have a list that they can trust. So where does that list come from? And again, if I go back to the TDIF example of Australia, there's a list of trusted organizations, if you like, that's maintained, so that the people that are kind of enabling information to be shared know which of these organizations are trusted. And that extends also to the thing we call it's called consumer data rights in Australia, where trusted institutions are named and listed, so that you can be sure that you're not sharing your banking information with some nefarious entity. So that's number four. Five is a little sort of indirect. What does the holder have to do with the governance framework? Well, in fact, I'd argue that we all, as citizens of countries, are likely to be paying taxes. Some of you may not be paying taxes, which is sort of interesting, but I think most of us probably are. And those taxes go to a number of things, and some of which are to do with governance frameworks. So I'll use another university example. The TEQSA system in Australia is a quality system for universities and higher education that has to be paid for by something, and it's effectively paid for by government taxes. And so that in a way, we are all, as citizens of kind of governed frameworks, paying money through indirect means, typically to support the governance framework. So there's a sort of another government economic flow there. Six is the really interesting one for decentralized models. And it's really interesting because we're trying to create a system that enables the verifier to check stuff in a very private and secure way with the holder, without involving anybody else, without involving an issuer, without involving any other sort of third party, to the best of their abilities. And we'll see a bit later that that's not always going to be the case, but that's the aim. Now, if that's the case, how does the issuer gain any kind of value, if you like, for the thing they've created? So if they've created a token or a credential that is of value to other parties in enabling economic transactions, how would they price it? How would they charge a fee for this token in a way that reflects its utility, its value to the participants? Now, that's not easy if you're not allowed to know what it's being used for in each of the individual transactions. So there are companies that are looking at ways of doing a kind of blinding process to enable economic value to go back to the issuer if the token is used. These used to be called premium credentials, as one of the phrases that was used way back in sort of 2017, 2018, when, say, Sovereign was being sort of developed. That sort of way of looking at it is one of the ways. Another way of looking at it is potentially that the issuer provides a kind of a license to verify without asking to know what the verification actions or transactions are by the verifier. So they give some capability, license or software for the verifier to check things. That can work too. Of course, what we see happening with that kind of approach is a rather restricted view of the decentralized sort of principles that we want to achieve. We want to achieve, if we are able, that your credentials are usable anywhere and with anyone that conforms to the sort of standards that we use. So W3C VCs, for example. We want that to be a universal way of doing things rather than having a constrained or kind of walled garden model. But nevertheless, those two approaches are trying to look at number six. I've actually outdated the slide. So if you've got the PDF, this is a brand new slide. And what I've realized I've sort of not pointed out something of an obvious observation is that those very transactions, those 6 I've labeled and talked to, kind of presuppose or create an opportunity for a 7th type, which is this whole software product system platform stuff that enables all of those 6. So we could think of services for issuers that can involve sort of issuing and management services for credentials. We can think of products and services for the holders. So wallets is the typical way of thinking about that, digital wallets and their agents. And we can think about services for the verifier, verification services and other things. So that inevitably we've got kind of services that belong to each of these separate parties that are the essence of what most of the product providers are looking at developing. What happens though to traditional third parties? So if we decentralize, if we take out the middleman in traditional transactions, by definition, that means they've gone, they've disappeared. So they kind of don't need to be there anymore. So why do we need them in the first place? What do these third parties exist for? They typically help us to fill gaps in knowledge. So it might be a provable fact that I went to a university, but perhaps you never went. No, sorry, you never even heard of that university before. So is it a university of any note? Is it a real university? Is it Trump University, which was once a real university but lost its license for obvious reasons? But so you need to fill in sometimes gaps. You know the information provided to you is issued by a certain party. It hasn't been tampered with. It's given to the holder, but you still don't know what the value is. The second kind of consideration might be what if somehow or other, the world being the world and complex and messy, I've been given fake information and I've relied upon it. So I've hired a car out to someone whose license turns out to be fake. Is there a way for me to insure myself against fake information? What else might I want to know that isn't visible to me in the credentials that they're offering that might be necessary for me to understand so that I can provide a service? Or perhaps I need a third party to make some sort of note of the transaction for legal or security reasons, like a notary service or whatever, or a witness service, if you like. So there might be other reasons for third parties. So we can see the creation of products. There's been a lot of them in the time that Joe and I have been looking at this market around the know your customer due diligence kind of services for banks. And there's an obvious reason for that. It costs banks a lot of money to do the customer due diligence checks, that the things that try to ensure that the customer is not part of some anti-money laundering process or counter or terrorism financing sort of process. So a number of companies have thought of ways in which they might be able to provide a product or a service to provide that to a bank. So hence to get this concept of a reusable KYC. So you or I might go through some checks, get some sort of known customer credential, and we use this known customer credential to provide to a bank, or perhaps the service provider provides the known customer credential to a bank as a service. But this doesn't really work very well in certain markets, certainly not in the Australian market. And I think it's probably true for others around the world. So there's a couple of reasons why it doesn't work very well currently, and another reason why it won't work very well in the future. It doesn't work very well currently because of the legal frameworks under which the liability is constructed. So in Australia, certainly that the relying party, the bank that relies upon information to decide whether to create an account or not, is liable for the decision they make. That means they can be legally sued, if you like, if they've made the wrong decision, and they can be penalized under the APRA rules and so on. So they are therefore disincentivized, they're not encouraged to make use of a service and just purely rely upon it, because they still are liable if that service is provided to be wrong. The second thing is slightly more interesting in the sense of it's a future reality that happens with verifiable credentials. If we are all carrying verifiable credentials in the future, and we are able to prove things, and these things can be authenticated by a relying party, then why do we need a third party to do any of that? Why do we need anybody to check this stuff that can be so easily checked? So we don't need to use a trusted third party to check stuff that we can check ourselves. But as I was sort of alluding to earlier, I think some of these third-party models will persist, and in fact, some new ones will kind of come to the fore. Some of the reasons I think they persist are that you might need to do further checks for legal reasons. That no matter the desire to have the minimal data exchange and to know as little as you can about the customer, the law might demand that you need to know more than they can sensibly present to you on their own. So you need to do some checks. We also can't assume that somebody will provide information that sort of invalidates their request for a service. So if you were to, you might ask for legal reasons, do you have any known impediments to you renting this car? Have you ever had a criminal offense for driving or something? Now, you would hope the person is honest in their reply, but you kind of can't prove that they've been honest. You can't do the search that says in your surface from your wallet things that actually kind of incriminate you or make invalid. But people may not do that. They'll say, no, I don't have that thing. So you've got to somehow sometimes check things in addition to the way that you ask the customer, because it's quite kind of not fair almost to ask them to incriminate themselves. Similarly, you can think of things like police checks and others where all that we are knowing when we see something that certifies a police check has been done is that a particular body in the police have done some particular checks at a particular point in time and found a particular result. It doesn't tell us what's happened since then and doesn't tell us what's happened outside of the scope of their investigation. So it is what it is, and it's no more than it is. So sometimes you might need to do more stuff. So fundamentally, our argument is the trusted third-party sort of models that will persist and thrive in the future are those that add value beyond authentication. So if you're just authenticating stuff, that ain't going to be very interesting in the future. That's actually going to be kind of become non-economic or not economically interesting. And I've given a rather complicated quote here that I really enjoyed when I read a paper on this sort of thinking, where it's kind of mixing two metaphors. One of them is that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. I just don't know which half. That sort of is one of the underlying thoughts in this sentence. So Sam Goldwyn was a very famous film mogul, and he's got many statements, many things attributed to him as quotes. This one is around the verbal contract not being worth the paper it's written on. The author of this particular document said he was only half right when he said that, and the half that is interesting, all that is interesting, the concept of trust lies precisely in the half which is wrong. And you'll have to think about that for a while before you kind of smirk, but it is kind of funny. Right, better models. This is a piece of work that Joe and I and others in CESU worked on for some time in 2018. We were trying to build up a model. Mostly we're working with a particular platform provider. We were trying to work out a model that was sort of an economic value model for the issuer, holder, verifier kind of construct. And you can see the second sort of the last two thirds of this particular screenshot are a whole bunch of parameters that we use to feed into the model to sort of try to drive it. And we used Monte Carlo simulation, and it was all kind of fancy stuff. But it was really, really complicated. And we couldn't really be sure that it was kind of right either. So it was really detailed, but it didn't really handle kind of multiple different types of use cases. That was going to be really hard because they have to have a whole new sets of parameters for different use cases. It was also only looking at it from a platform point of view. Now, something nearly now 12 months ago, we started working on a really interesting project here I'm in London, in Australia, which was looking at the sort of economic value for a government, for a state government in Australia, for digital identity and verifiable credentials. So we had to kind of think about this whole problem differently. It's not about the pricing model for the platform provider, it becomes the economic model for the whole of government for a state. And that changes your way of thinking about stuff. So we started having to do a few things, and we knew, because we were seeing them come towards us, there will be hundreds of use cases sort of thrown at us, ideas, if you like, about ways that this might be really good. We can do this, we can do that, we can do this thing. So we had to have a way in which we could consider thoughtfully all of these use cases, no matter how many were thrown at us. And we had to have a process where the individual participants, these are state government agencies and departments, could feel comfortable that their use case, something that their department might benefit from, arguably, was considered in a way that they could see was sort of transparent. They could see how it had been thought of, why it had succeeded or perhaps not succeeded, and what sort of time frame it might be deliverable, and what would the budget sort of benefit and cost and so on. So we had to have this process that was transparent. That's partly because in any organization, governments included, often the initiatives are led by, hopefully led by, strong, passionate, enthusiastic individuals. And the concern sometimes can be that individual actually determines what the priorities or changes are, or the order in which things are done. And certainly in a government environment, you've always got this tension where there's only ever a finite budget, there's a finite amount of time, there's a prioritization process to decide what you invest on, who goes first. And they need to make sure that process of decision-making is transparent. It can't just be because the project sponsor has tweeted the last thing on their phone. It's got to be something more transparent than that. So we built this 3-step process. So we built a process that we wanted to be transparent so people could see how it worked. We wanted to be traceable. They could see how we've made these decisions along the process. And it has 3 steps. So the first step is you get all these use cases that people throw at you in various ways, and you kind of think about them in a certain way and you put them through a filter. And those that make it through the filter, you then start looking at how you score them. So you score the use cases that go through the filter. And once you've got these scores against certain criteria, you can then make a decision about selecting. And we've separated out the process so that it's not automatic in terms of there's a human, it's sort of a algorithm-supported human process rather than a strict algorithmic process, because we believe these things are complicated or complex, and in fact therefore need human sort of consideration as well as mechanical consideration. Now, I can see a chat popped up, so I don't know whether or not you're handling that job. I'll assume you are. So does the process? You're on it? Cool. The process starts with some simple qualification checks. So that the checks we're thinking about are really kind of, they seem trivial, but they're really important. So simple enough. We were finding that we were getting use cases for decentralized sort of trust of digital identity and verifiable credentials that were multi-step transactions. Many things had to happen before this one thing could be true. So we kind of said, well, let's keep it simple. Let's do a simple single step transaction kind of process first. Is it practical? So the kind of consideration that includes is, the government agency or the department own the data that you're talking about here? Is it your data to issue as a credential? Is it kind of your gift? Does it make use of existing authorities and legislation, or are we creating a whole brand new thing? If we're going to have to change the law, that means a whole new type of work needs to be done and so on. It takes longer. Is it timely? So does it address the current and or near future kind of issue that we can see from a government point of view? The sensible thing is does it make sense? So from a government point of view, does it enable new markets or improve existing markets without conflicting with some legitimate commercial interests? And for commercial entities, it might be, does it fit just sort of current business strategy and vision? So does it make sense for you as organizations to do this thing? And with those 5 key areas, we grouped the kind of thinking into sort of 5 key areas. Each of those 5 key areas had 4 criteria. So we had 20 criteria, which is more than enough. But it turns out that you always want to add another one, but we try to stick to a number that was semi-handleable, so 20. And we grouped them into 5 areas. So the reach, how many people or organizations would be included in this use case. The change, how much change is necessary for this to actually happen. This is going to be fundamentally different to everything we've done before. It's going to be something fairly familiar. And that includes for each of the parties. So for the issuer, the holder, the verifier. How complex is it? Legal, technical, operations. How difficult is it going to be to do this sort of thing? What are the benefits? In terms of dollars, counts, time, qualitative, quantitative, and the perception. How would people? So remember, this is a government framework that we originally developed. What would the public think? So we actually coined this as the pub test when we were thinking about this in Australia, where the culture in Australia might be that within a pub environment, someone might voice hey, what do you think the government doing this? And someone go, oh, it's fantastic, or you got to be kidding. So the pub test concept is the idea of a public or a kind of popular response to the idea of doing this thing. And a company might consider it the same way as a sort of market test in terms of how something might be accepted or welcomed by the market. When we look at these sort of 5 different areas, we can decide to group them in certain ways. So what we're heading towards is simplification of a complex thing. And for every complex problem, there's a simple, clear answer that is typically wrong. But we're trying to avoid doing something inherently wrong by our simplification process. So we've got our 5 key areas, and we can now group them. And for example, we can group them into 2 areas, as we've shown here, which could be considered impact. So reach, benefit, perception could be impact. And ease of implementation could be change readiness and complexity. So that will be a way of grouping the 5 into 2. And the reason you wanted to go into 2 is because people like drawing 2-dimensional bloody graphs. So would they like to see something like this? This is the classic top right-hand corner graph. What's in the top right-hand corner? And let's make sure the most attractive things are there. So to make that work for a graph, we've used an ease of implementation axis on the bottom, where it goes from low ease, so difficult, to high ease, so easy, on the bottom. And for positive impact, we've gone for low positive impact, so it's not very good, So high positive impact is great, everybody loves it. And if you draw the axis in that way, you can then get the top right-hand corner becoming those particular use cases that meet the, it's easy to do and you get a high impact, so why wouldn't you kind of things. That's the visual representation of all that kind of data that we were gathering about use cases before. Key things to think about this model. I had lots of very good conversations with Benny about this model, and one of the things is that you have to configure it for each of the kind of instances you're working. It would be lovely, kind of lovely, if we had a one single model to address all possible markets, contexts, and use cases, but I'd actually be a bit wary of that. I think that at the very least, you need to review the structure of the model, the kind of key elements and the processes and the criteria you're using and the weighting to make sure it is fit for the purpose that you're using it for now. So if you're addressing an education market or a financial market or a transport market, I'd argue you might need to think about different criteria or at least give them different weights. So you need to think about the criteria you're using, you need to think about the relationship between the sort of key areas, but how you might bundle them or not. And you've got to think about the weighting you give to each of the sort of considerations so that something might be more important in one context or another. So the model has to be configured, but we can actually, we do think it's pretty damn useful. So here's an example, some of the types of use cases that we were looking at for the business case that we're doing for the government. So things like first aid certificates through to bank accounts. And quite literally, those are the kind of examples of things we're being asked to consider. And for each of those, we've got that sort of 5 key areas. You might remember: a single step, existing credential, existing laws, government data, fits government purpose kind of questions. And you can see that we've got a kind of a yes, yes, no, no kind of thing happening across the board. So while someone might say, as I alluded to earlier, crikey, banks are going through pain doing the KYC kind of checks, know your customer checks. Why don't we do that for them? And you go, there's several reasons why that's not necessarily a good idea. It's kind of like, it's not really your business. And you don't necessarily have all of the information necessary to provide that service in any case. So it kind of doesn't really stand the test when you start looking at that kind of idea. So it rapidly becomes something you can't do. What you can do, though, is to break that bank KYC thing down into, well, you do provide some things that are useful to the bank. So if you provide some of your government credentials as a verifiable credential, that might actually help the bank KYC process down the track, but you're not doing bank KYC as a product. You're doing you're enabling better processes of bank KYC. So that means you can quickly filter out, if you like, as the first step, our filtering process, those use cases that are worthy of further consideration. So now, in this instance, I'm showing on the screen, first aid certificate is one thing, and proof of academic records and achievements might be another. Those are both within the gift of the government agencies we were working with, are working with, and they make every sense to be the ones